U.S. House of Representatives. It's the very first day of a brand new Congress, and every single representative is ready to elect the Speaker of the House. You know, you'd think it would be a pretty straightforward process, right? Well, our sources for this deep dive are actually snippets from a live news broadcast, and these snippets show us just how not straightforward this election was.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, we're not just reading some dry account here, right? Like, we're experiencing this whole thing, the tension, the drama as it actually happened. And it all starts with Mike Johnson, Donald Trump's pick for Speaker. And you'd think with that endorsement from Trump, he would have it in the bag. But then 3 Republicans vote against him, and he could only afford to lose 1 vote.
Oh, wow. It's like watching a political thriller play out in real time. I can almost hear the gasps in the room when those votes came in. Suddenly, this small handful of representatives have the power to completely derail everything.
Exactly. And it's not just some theoretical abstract power play. Without a speaker, the House can't really do much of anything. They couldn't even certify Trump's win until this whole speaker situation was figured out. It's crazy how important this seemingly routine vote actually is.
So what was actually happening down on the House floor? I mean, our sources must have caught at least some of that chaos.
Oh, absolutely. So just imagine this frantic scramble with Johnson's allies working the phones, trying to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. Meanwhile, you have all this intense negotiating going on behind closed doors. And all this is happening while the news cameras are rolling, trying to make sense of it all.
Wow. It's wild to think that those 3 dissenting votes, Thomas Massey Keith's self and Ralph Norman, had that much power in that moment. I mean, were they really willing to risk throwing the entire government into complete disarray?
Well, 2 of them, Self and Norman, did eventually switch their votes. But what's really interesting is that all 3 of these guys were considered very strong Trump supporters.
Wait, so they voted against the candidate endorsed by the president they're aligned with? That's pretty surprising. There must have been something more going on there.
Right. It suggests that their opposition wasn't just about personal ambition or political maneuvering. There were some deeper principles or concerns at play. And this wasn't like the 15-ballot ordeal that Kevin McCarthy went through a couple years back. This all went down in one crazy round of voting.
Okay, so 2 of the Republicans flipped, but Massey stood firm. What happened next? Did Johnson actually manage to become Speaker with that 1 vote against him?
Yeah, he did, by the skin of his teeth. Those 2 switched votes were enough to win him the gavel, but it was not a comfortable victory. And this is where it gets really insightful, I think. It really highlights something crucial about governing with such a slim majority, something you as the listener should really understand.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, the Republicans had what's called unified control in Washington after this election. So that means they controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress. But this whole nail-biter of a speaker vote really foreshadowed just how difficult governing was going to be for them, even with that unified control.
Oh, I see. So even though Republicans were technically in charge, that 1 dissenting vote showed that their power wasn't absolute.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about Massey's single vote. What this revealed was that even a small group of representatives could wield a ton of power. They could block legislation-forced compromises and even bring the entire legislative process to a standstill if they were determined enough.
Wow. That really puts things in perspective. It makes you realize that these seemingly boring procedural votes can have huge implications for how the entire government functions.
Absolutely. And for someone like Johnson, who is now in charge of leading a House with a super slim majority, this close call must have been a huge wake-up call. It meant he couldn't just assume that he could just push through any legislation he wanted.
So it wasn't just about advancing Trump's agenda. It was also about managing all those internal party dynamics and trying to maintain at least some semblance of unity.
Exactly. This speaker election wasn't just a one-time event. It was like a microcosm of the challenges the Republicans would face over the next few years as they tried to govern effectively. It exposed the fault lines within the party and the potential for even small disagreements to blow up into major consequences.
Yeah, it's fascinating how just this one event, the speaker election, can show us so much about how our political system really works.
It's kind of like we're peeking behind the curtain, right? We could actually see all the compromises, the power struggles, the different personalities.
Yeah.
And how all of that impacts how our government actually functions.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that these dissenting Republicans were all strong Trump supporters. So what does that tell us about the Republican Party back then?
Well, it shows that even within just one party, there can be some pretty significant differences when it comes to ideology. It wasn't just about being pro-Trump or anti-Trump. It's likely these representatives had specific concerns about Johnson's leadership, maybe his legislative priorities, or even just his style of governing.
So what were some of the big issues that might cause this rift? I mean, our sources must have captured some of the main talking points from that day.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Think about the political landscape at the time. There are these ongoing debates about government spending, healthcare reform, immigration policy, all these really hot-button issues that could easily create divisions within a party.
And all those divisions were on full display during the speaker election. It wasn't just a symbolic vote. It was a chance for these representatives to make a statement, to signal their priorities and maybe even try to influence the direction of the new Congress.
Right. It's like they were saying, hey, we're here, we have a voice, and we're not afraid to use it, even if it means going against our own party's leadership.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what kind of pressure those representatives must have been under. I mean, were they getting calls from their constituents, from lobbyists, from the White House?
Oh, I'm sure the pressure was enormous. And that's another key takeaway here. Even though we have a representative democracy, where we elect officials to speak for us, those officials are constantly being pulled in different directions by all sorts of interest groups.
Right, so they've got to balance their own principles with the needs of their constituents and the demands of their party, all while navigating this super complicated web of relationships and power dynamics. No wonder things can get so messy.
It really is a delicate dance.
Yeah.
And for those dissenting Republicans, it was a big gamble. They were risking alienating their own party, maybe jeopardizing their committee assignments, and even possibly facing a backlash from their constituents.
But at the same time, they were also taking a stand for what they believed in. It shows that even in a system that often prioritizes party loyalty over everything else, there's still some room for individual conscience and principled dissent.
Right. And that's what makes this whole situation so interesting. It forces us to ask ourselves, what would we do in that situation? Would we prioritize party unity? Or would we stick to our convictions even if it meant going against the grain?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, and there's no easy answer. It really depends on the person, the issue, and the potential consequences.
And think about it from Mike Johnson's perspective. The newly elected speaker. He barely won, even with those two switch votes.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about the challenges he was probably going to face in leading a Congress with such a tiny majority?
Yeah, I imagine it must have been incredibly hard to keep any kind of unity or control. Every vote would have been a nail-biter. Every single piece of legislation a potential battleground.
Exactly. He would have to constantly negotiate, compromise, make concessions just to keep his own party in line. And that's not even considering the opposition from the Democrats.
It makes you wonder if this close call, this early sign of internal division, might have actually weakened the Republicans' ability to govern effectively. Did they have to water down their agenda? Were they less willing to push for big changes because they were afraid of losing those crucial swing votes?
That's a great question. And it's something that historians and political scientists are still debating. Some people think this event forced the Republicans to be more pragmatic, more willing to compromise. Others say that it actually made the divisions in the party even worse, which made it even harder to govern.
So even though Johnson became the speaker, this close call kind of cast a shadow over his entire time in office. It set the stage for this period of intense political maneuvering, where every single vote mattered and every decision carried a lot of weight.
Exactly. And for the listener, it highlights a really important point. The political process isn't always about big speeches and sweeping legislative victories. Sometimes it's about these smaller, more subtle moments that can actually have just as big of an impact on the direction of our country.
Right. It's like those little things that happen in our own lives that seem insignificant at the time. But looking back, they turn out to be major turning points.
Exactly. And that's what's so great about really digging into these historical moments. We start to see the connections, the ripple effects, and how individual choices can shape the bigger picture.
I'm actually curious to learn more about these dissenting Republicans, Massey Self and Norman. What were their motivations? What happened to them in the years after this?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
It's like we're putting together this big political puzzle. We've got the big picture, the speaker election, the slim majority, the potential for total disaster. But now we're kind of zooming in on these individual pieces, these dissenting Republicans, to see how they all fit in.
Yeah, and those pieces are often the most interesting ones. Remember, we were talking about Thomas Massey, Keith Self, and Ralph Norman. All three were considered to be pretty strong conservatives. They all agreed with Trump on a lot of issues. But they were still willing to go against him and their party leadership on this really important vote.
So if it wasn't just about being loyal to Trump, What were their reasons? What were they hoping to accomplish by dissenting?
Well, let's start with Massey. He's known for being a bit of a maverick.
Yeah.
Like a really strong libertarian. He believes in limited government. He's often been critical of both Democrats and Republicans for spending too much money and overreaching.
So for him, this vote might have been less about Johnson himself and more about kind of making a statement about his own beliefs, his vision for how he thinks the government should work.
Exactly. It was like him saying, hey, I'm not just here to agree with everything the party says. I'm here to represent the people who voted for me and to stand up for what I believe in. And remember, this wasn't just some symbolic thing. Massey's vote could have actually thrown the whole speakership election into chaos.
Yeah, that takes a lot of courage to stand up to your own party, especially when they have the majority. Knowing that you could face a lot of backlash or even be kind of pushed out, it makes you wonder if Massey's decision to dissent was some sort of calculated political move or if it was really a genuine act of principle.
It's tough to say for sure. It was probably a little bit of both. Massey's a smart politician. He definitely understood how much impact his vote would have. But he's also shown over and over that he's willing to go against the grain and fight for what he believes in, even when it's not popular.
So what about the other two? Self and Norman, they ended up switching their votes, but what were their initial concerns?
Well, both of them were known for being fiscal conservatives. They were worried about government spending the national debt and what they saw as a lack of responsibility when it came to money in Washington. It's possible they saw Johnson as too willing to compromise on these issues. Or maybe they were trying to get some concessions from him before they would support him.
So maybe for them it was more about using their votes to get specific policy outcomes.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. They might have been using their power to try to influence the new Congress, to make sure that fiscal conservatism stayed a top priority. And even though they did switch their votes, in the end, their initial dissent sent a clear message that they weren't afraid to use their power to make sure they were heard.
It's like this big game of political chess, isn't it? Every move is carefully planned out. Every vote is like a bargaining chip.
Right. And that's what makes all of this so fascinating. It reminds us that politics is this really complicated and ever-changing process, full of competing interests, strategic moves, and unexpected twists and turns.
Okay, so we have these three dissenting Republicans, each with their own reasons and strategies. What happened to them after all this? Did their decision to dissent have any lasting impact on their careers or on the Republican Party as a whole?
Well, this is where our deep dive gets really interesting. Massey, as you might expect, remained kind of an outsider. He often voted against his own party on key issues. He continued to be a big advocate for libertarian principles and became a really vocal critic of things like government surveillance, getting involved in other countries' affairs, and what he saw as too much power in the hands of the president.
So he kind of leaned into his maverick image. He became even more of an independent voice within the Republican Party.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't afraid to challenge the way things were done, even if it meant going against his own party. And while he didn't always win, he definitely made his voice heard and made his colleagues think about some things they might not have wanted to.
What about Self and Norman? Did their initial dissent have any lasting effects on their careers or on their relationship with the Republican leaders?
Well, they both stayed loyal Republicans. They usually voted with their party on most things. But their willingness to break from the party during that speaker election shows that they weren't afraid to stand up for what they believed in when they thought it was important. And that kind of independence, even if it's only sometimes, can be really valuable in a political system that often values party unity over everything else.
It's like they earned some credibility, a reputation for being willing to think for themselves and not just follow the party line without question.
Exactly. And that kind of reputation can give you more power in future negotiations.
Yeah.
It lets you push for the things that are important to you and have a say in how laws are made.
So what does all of this mean for us, the listeners? Why should we care about this crazy speaker election from all those years ago?
It's a good reminder that our political system is constantly changing and evolving. It's shaped by the choices people make, by moments of bravery and compromise, and by the constant back and forth between different groups who all want different things. It also reminds us that even events that seem small or unimportant, like a vote for Speaker of the House, can actually have big effects that last for a long time.
It also shows us how important it is to understand why politicians do the things they do and what their strategies are. They're not just nameless faces in a system. They're real people with their own beliefs, ambitions, and ways of thinking. And by understanding these individuals, we can understand the whole system better.
And for those of you who are interested in getting more involved in politics and shaping the future of our country, this story has a valuable lesson. It reminds us that change doesn't always happen in big, dramatic ways. Sometimes it's about making smaller, more strategic moves, about finding ways to make your voice heard and use your vote to make a difference.
So if you're feeling inspired, go do some research. Learn more about these dissenting Republicans. Explore the policy debates that were happening at the time, and think about how these seemingly minor events might have shaped the political landscape in the years that followed.
And as you do that, remember that politics is something we all participate in. It's not just something that happens to us, it's something we can all shape and influence. Even if it's just by staying informed, having thoughtful discussions, and voting in a way that reflects what we believe in.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration of the world around us.